Thank you all very much. So just to get things started, how many people has someone in their office that's actually using drones for surveying? Okay, not a ton, which is good because I can walk you through everything that there is about drone surveying. And there's a lot of misconceptions. It's obviously a very new technology, especially relative to the world of surveying and everything that Bob just spoke about. And what I'm going to go over today is, like I said, I'm here for a couple hours actually to talk about three main things. First off is the drone surveying, the legal landscape surrounding flying drones, drone surveying, and everything that entails. Next, we'll talk about the actual technology in drone surveying, and really then go through a whole drone program workflow. Just show you kind of what it looks like, every single step of that drone surveying process, whether you use it or not. Because drone surveying, like a lot of surveying technology, there are different business models for all of it too. Some companies will bring everything inside, from flying the drone to setting the control and all the processing. Other people will outsource different bits here and there. One guy fly it, another surveyor set the control, someone else do the data processing. There are different things, but we'll go through kind of all of those different steps, talk about some of the different options. Because for me, when we talk about the end goal of drone surveying, why would you use a drone? There are actually a bunch of reasons to use drones for surveying technology, but the main three that we have is, one, just get better deliverables. Rather than just maybe a normal CAD file, which of course is super valuable, but being able to have live up-to-date imagery behind it. Imagery of the site on the day that you are actually there is really valuable. It's really valuable to have those records. We talked a lot about record keeping already today. Having just imagery records of the exact condition of the site is really good to settle any disputes and really give context to all of the work that you already do. But another reason is to save time. One of the reasons why drone surveying has been so popular is because it means a lot less time in the field. And also it means less money. Less time means less money more often than not. It doesn't take as long to process. It means that you can actually save money. And the other thing that I actually don't have on here that is kind of a shame is that it's safer too. Especially when you are working in a lot of roadways, it's a lot safer when you can get your people out of various roadways or out of dangerous areas, or where they don't have to climb up, unstable terrain where you can just fly a drone over it. But unfortunately, most people don't actually like paying for safety-related things until they legally are required to. So that's why we focus on the other three. Better data, save time, save money, and the safety is just kind of free in there. Because ultimately, when we talk about drone surveying, again, I've been working in drone surveying since about 2014, which strangely makes me about the oldest drone surveyor out there. But when I talk about drone surveying, I'm not saying, hey, fly up a drone, take a picture. That's cool, right? No, a survey drone by drone should look like a survey, like any other survey. It should have the data that you need, and it should have your seal in there, and it should be accurate. So we look at something like this, and you say, okay, well, what was taken by the drone? And the answer is, you don't know, and that's okay. In the sense that as long as the data is accurate, you might have different sources for different information, whether you pull it from historical records. I mean, you notate all of that on the survey itself, but whether it came from a drone or a total station or GPS, you can actually blend all of these different sources together into a single survey. And that's part of a good use of a drone as a tool for land surveying. It's part of many things. In this case, the imagery was obviously done by drone, so it's totally up to date with any new improvements, like up to the minute of the survey. And I forget exactly which parts, but it's part of that blended workflow. So that's what a drone program, that's what the end result of a drone surveying program ought to look like. And that's what we'll walk through a little bit once we get later today. What I always say, your drone program isn't saving you time and money, it's not working. That's what it's there to do. I talk about drone surveying not as a research project. This is not a, hey, go out there, spend $100 grand and do a project and say, cool, we did that, and then just go back to doing everything that you did before. If it's managed properly, a drone surveying program will save you huge amounts of time, huge amounts of money, make your life easier, let you get your projects done better. It just really makes everything better around every aspect. And it's kind of fun too. It's fun being a pilot and being able to fly these drones. So, all right, so a little bit kind of about me and my company, Aerotas. We started in 2014. We do data processing for surveyors. And for civil engineers actually as well. Been around for about 6 years now, coming up on 6 years. And we work all around the country. So the way that we work, the reason why we give all these talks is we actually process the data for surveyors all over the place. Photogrammetry, line work drafting, this isn't a sales pitch, but we do work throughout the country for a lot of people in Washington State too, including counties, DOT, that sort of thing. So that's why we've been able to learn all of this stuff. So I want to talk first about the drone surveying journey. Now there's a lot of misconceptions about drone surveying. Like I said, a lot of people think drone surveying is just taking a picture, and all of the actual survey parts that really need to have good accuracy is still done on the ground. And that's kind of how a lot of people start. It's hard to tell right here, I can send all these slides after the fact. But at the beginning is just kind of basic photos and videos. People say, I want a drone. In fact, I was looking around beforehand. Washington State DOT has a blog where they talk about drone surveying that they did. And there was a rock slide, I believe, and they used a drone to go just take pictures and say, hey, how dangerous is it? Can we go through? That's awesome. But that's really just the beginning of a drone surveying program. You start with basic photos, and then you go to ortho photos. Those are your ortho-rectified imagery, where you actually preserve your distances. You can use it to back up a plat. You can use it as part of a broader GIS program. So that's a good start. There are a lot of online softwares that do that. You take a bunch of drone photos, throw them at an online software, and poof, you get a beautiful ortho photo image back. Next step up there is going to be high accuracy and high precision ortho photos. So that means a photo where you could actually take measurements from it and get good data. Whether you are measuring a right-of-way, whether you're measuring how much curb line there is, measuring areas, how many parking stalls, making sure that measurements from the ortho photo are actually accurate. And when I talk about accuracy, accuracy is obviously very dependent on the project that you're working on and what you need. Some things may require, only a half foot of accuracy. There are a lot of times where people are doing rough topo over a couple hundred or maybe a couple thousand acres or more. And if you've got half a foot accuracy, then that's plenty to do, half foot contours, 1 foot contours. Other times you need a 1/10 of a foot better. Sometimes it needs to be so tight you'll still need to take out a total station. But that's kind of the next step, getting that high accuracy, high precision. Next up is going to 3D data, DSMs and point clouds. Drone surveying is a lot more than just 2D data. In fact, everything that we do in all 3D, which means that now you can start getting curve lines out of this as well. And topo, like I said, really accurate topo data is really valuable to get from a drone. Then start getting that into clean CAD drawings, final survey deliverables. As you integrate all of that together, you start integrating it with all of the various property records, with the stuff that you shot on the ground, with monuments, things that can't be seen from the air, and then you put it all together in a final workflow. So that's kind of what we've often seen as people fly drones. They start at the bottom, they just start taking pictures, and then you kind of add more and more and more complexity until you can actually start integrating this into an entire survey workflow. So that the way we see with a lot of people, they start out, whenever they go to the site, one of the first things they'll do is actually set some control, tie in, and then fly it with the drone. And that's kind of like the base map. They build everything else out off from there. So that's how we go from there. So before we jump into the legal landscape and start talking about the really, really fun world of drone laws, I want to point out, I like this to be as interactive as possible, so please, if anyone at any point has a question, raise your hand to interrupt me. I like interacting with you guys. That's how we all kind of learn from each other, because I might be missing something that you're thinking about, so I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. All right, so let's get right into the meat of this, and let's start with the legal landscape, which is Part 107. So any people in here, Part 107 certified, have your drone pilot's license? Okay, just a few, that's great. So this would probably be a lot of clicking through automatically. I didn't know it did that. Some of this information might be new. So one of the easiest things as I talk about Part 107, that's just the federal laws for drone land surveying. And one of the nice things about flying drones is something called federal preemption. And what that basically means is the federal government sets the drone laws. There really are there are negligible amounts of state, county, or city laws when it comes to operating drones, because the FAA about 100 years ago pretty much said, we own the airspace, we're the only ones that can create laws, anything else confuses people. That made a heck of a lot of sense when the only things in the air were airliners flying state to state. Now it makes a little bit less sense, but regardless, it's easy for us because there's only one set of drone laws. You really don't have to worry too much about local restrictions on where you can and can't fly. So Part 107 is the federal drone law. What I'm going to go with you today, I want to go over all of the basics of the Part 107 law, answer any questions you might have, and then also I'm going to give you guys some more resources so that you have access to all the online study materials so that you can go out and you can actually pass the test. This is, to get your drone license, it's just a one-time test. I think it's a 3-hour time limit. If you get a 70%, you're good to go. You got your drone license. That's all it takes. Yeah, let's go.
It's no joke.
It is no joke, but it's one time.
So one of the study courses said that there's a recurring test every 2 years. Is that?
Yes, and it's easier than the original one.
Okay.
Some of the most nuanced, detailed stuff, you remember like weather stuff from the test, that goes away.
So every 2 years you do have to do that.
Every 2 years, but they're actually probably going to change that in about a year so that it's just like an online thing to renew it, which makes it a lot easier. So yeah, we'll go over the test. But like I said, I actually have some resources for you guys that are online training materials so that you can go out and pass the test yourself, because lots and lots of people have gotten it. The way that I always tell people or recommend it to people, do your studying 2 days before the test, take the test, and then you can forget literally everything in the test because it's one of those types of tests. So of the different things that are in there are restrictions on the type of aircraft you can use, operational limitations, weather, location, pilot certification, special laws for model aircraft users, and then something called waivers, which is to do everything outside of what is even within the law. So let's start with aircraft restrictions. First off, must weigh less than 55 pounds. It's got to be registered with the FAA. It does not need to be physically inspected or approved by the FAA. You must perform a pre-flight inspection before all flights, and external payloads are allowed if securely attached and doesn't hurt flight characteristics. Now, what does all this mean from practical standpoint? Everything that you think of as a drone is totally legal. Why? Because it fits into this, and that's why they build them. It's pretty much hard for anyone to buy a non-legal aircraft itself. They all fall within these rules. The nice thing is if you're flying the test, no, you don't need any sort of special inspection by the FAA. It's not like a car where you need to get it smog tested or anything like that. It needs to be registered, but that's a $5 one-time fee that you do online, and then you just either print or Sharpie the license plate on your drone. So that's kind of the aircraft restriction. Most of the time with drone surveys, you're using anything from a 3-pound drone up to about a 10, 20-pound drone on the really, really big side. But most of them are usually about 3 to 5 pounds. Question? Yeah?
Is there a weight category where you don't need a license?
250 grams and below, which is about half a pound. So for all practical purposes, that's like the toy category. It's very difficult to do anything of any professional use in the very small side.
This was just a recreational question.
No, that's true. And I'll actually touch a little bit on recreational rules. And it's a good topic to bring up because the FAA is kind of split. There's like the recreational set of laws, and then there's the commercial set of laws. I'm going to be talking mostly about the commercial stuff here. The recreational stuff has their own really kind of weird things. If you fly in certain areas, then you can do stuff that you otherwise couldn't do anywhere else. But I fly recreational too, so I know a lot of those things. Operational limitations, these are not huge limitations for most people. Maximum ground speed of 100 miles an hour, not a big deal. Maximum altitude of 400 feet. That's a bigger deal. We'll talk about that in a second. It's worth noting that's 400 feet above ground, not takeoff. So wherever you go, as long as you're within 400 feet of the ground or within 400 feet of a structure, you're actually totally okay to fly. So you can actually fly above 400 feet as long as you're within 400 feet of a tower building, something like that. Now for drone surveying purpose, yeah?
Was that always 400 feet or was it 500 before when it first started? For some reason I got 500 in my head.
Since Part 107's been out, it's always been 400. There was an older set of regulations that were called the 333 exemptions where some things were 500 feet. But 400 is definitely the number. Also 500, there's a counter set of rules for manned aircraft like helicopters. Manned helicopters are not supposed to fly below 500. So there's that kind of 100-foot buffer zone in there to try and keep the airspace safe. So yeah, 400 feet, if anyone's flown a drone and looks up, 400 feet is actually really, really high for a small kind of unmanned vehicle. It's almost invisible and very difficult to hear at that point. So that's really about as high as you even need to go for all surveying purposes for the types of drones that have become a lot more common. So next up, sense and avoid. This is one of the biggest ones that people don't like. The law says when you're flying a drone, you have to be able to see and avoid other traffic or dangers in the airspace, and you must observe the airspace for other air traffic or hazards. Pretty straightforward, right? If you're flying a drone, look around, and if there's a plane, get out of the way. Pretty simple in that sense. The biggest limitation that comes from this is drone technology is actually so advanced now that I could set a drone and then just go in my car and let it fly for an hour and kind of do its thing, and I wouldn't need to look at it at all. But that's not legal. You do need to sit there and monitor the airspace for anyone flying there. The way that kind of it works, drones are the low man on the totem pole. If there's any other air traffic, it is your job. It is your job to yield to the other air traffic. Drones always have to yield, and you always have to see for it. Yeah.
I thought you had to have a spotter. Don't you have to have a spotter?
Used to, not anymore. That's called a visual observer, and I think I have a slide on that later on. But yeah, it used to require a visual observer in order to see, to basically have a second set of eyes watching the drone. Not required anymore. That is allowed though. And if you have a spotter, then you yourself don't even have to be watching it. Technically, I could have a spotter out there, and then I could just sit in the car, and sit in the truck, have a cup of coffee, let someone else kind of watch the drone. So what's required is no longer. Another thing that I should actually point out, which is really that might cause some confusion, especially in this room. About 3 years ago, all government-related agencies had a totally different set of rules than private citizens and private corporations. That is no longer the case. It did used to be the case. There's still some documentation out there saying that it is the case. But that is not true anymore. With these set of laws that are called Part 107, that actually brought all public agencies under the same umbrella of laws that private companies use as well. It's all Part 107. So again, if you see documentation that says, oh no, we're a public agency, or we work for public agencies, we've got to get called a Certificate of Authorization, or a COA, or what some of them are called. That is old documentation and no longer the case. These are the rules that have kind of taken precedence as of 3 years ago. All right, so that's see and avoid. The other thing is visual line of sight. The aircraft must always remain within visual line of sight of the operator or a designated visual observer, which is exactly what we were talking about beforehand. That means you need to be able to see the aircraft unaided by anything other than corrective lenses. Onboard cameras do not count for this requirement, but you may use them as well. Now, of course, every drone has an onboard camera these days, which is really useful, and heck, that's the purpose of it, is being able to gather good photography, but being able to see it with your eyes, that's a legal requirement. Now, what does that translate to in practice? It basically means your eyes are good to see a drone unaided to about 2,000 feet. Beyond that, you can obviously see things, but the drone itself, when it's small and up in the sky, it more or less disappears after about 2,000 feet. And if you kind of draw a 2,000-foot radius around yourself, that means you can cover something like 150, 200 acres from a single spot. So you actually can cover an enormous amount of land. And when you're doing kind of right-of-ways or other linear corridors, whether you're doing a roadway or something, that means you can do 4,000 feet about from a single place before you need to pick up the drone and do another 4,000 feet. Now, obviously doing 4,000 feet of road survey in about half an hour, 45 minutes, not a bad deal. So here's more details on that visual observer thing. Designated person that helps the pilot in command see and avoid other air traffic. Their sole duty is to observe the aircraft, and it lets you fly further than one person's line of sight. Which means if you actually coordinate pretty well, you can have yourself standing here, another person standing half mile down the road, and then your drone can fly, a mile and a quarter or something before you even have to take it back and drive further down the road. They must coordinate to scan the airspace for hazards, remain in communication, and awareness of the aircraft through direct visual observation. Kind of a nice little thing that will help people, especially when new pilots are uncomfortable flying drones, having a partner as a spotter to help you just kind of keep an eye on everything. But once you get more than 1 or 2 flights under your belt, people are so confident. This technology is so damn reliable nowadays. You just push a button and it just kind of does its thing, and you just look around and make sure no helicopters come in the way. So next up, there are a couple of restrictions on the law. 1 pilot, 1 aircraft. You are not allowed to have 1 person operating multiple drones at one time. No operations from a moving aircraft as well. You can't fly your drone while sitting in a Cessna, as awesome as that would be. No operations from a moving vehicle, with a couple of asterisks on there, unless it is over a sparsely populated area. Quite frankly, we've actually tested this one before and strongly recommended against it. It's really near impossible to keep your eyes on the road, on the drone, on the ground it's supposed to be working with, without a crew of at least 4 people, all like in the vehicle. 1 person's piloting, 1 person's looking at the drone, 1 person's driving. Like, it's really difficult to manage all of those things together. So it's easier to park, fly a quarter mile, or fly half a mile, drive and do another half mile.
Question?
Yeah.
We were looking at this aspect of it, that, you know, you can set these up to follow you as you go, and a lot of times we fly drones, but way high, so we can't get underneath the canopy coverage.
Yep.
So we were thinking about, you know, like flying a drone at maybe 30 feet above the roadway, maybe have like 2 vehicles, one actually running the drone itself, and then the vehicle behind it actually being the observer. Would that work?
So from a legal perspective, that's totally legal.
Okay.
From a data perspective, no, unfortunately. When you get that close, so the principles are photogrammetry. It's using multiple images to create 3D models. When you actually get that close to the ground, it's what I kind of call the drinking straw effect. That you're so close to the ground, it's like trying to do a survey by looking through a drinking straw. The single photo that you're taking it covers so little of the ground that you can't accurately create a 3D model. Or if you're, to be more clear about it, you could, but you need to set a control point about every 10 to 15 feet when it's that close to the ground. And once you're setting that much control, it's like, well, you're already shooting a point every 10 feet. Just shoot the friggin' road. Basically, drinking straw effect, the lowest safe operating altitude, safe and good data operating altitude for a drone survey is about 100 feet. Anything below 100 feet, and you really start to lose any of the benefits of flying the drone.
What if you slow down the speed of the drone?
Speed's not the limiting factor there. It's the size of the footprint, and yeah, the follow me feature is totally legal, and quite frankly, if you're like skiing, it's super awesome. But from a surveying perspective, you want to be a little bit higher, and you want your photos pretty much straight down, covering a bigger footprint of land, in order to get the right triangulation of data for good photogrammetry. And then there's the big kind of catch-all in the law, back to the legal side. So yeah, like I said, legal, but not good from a data standpoint. The big catch-all legally is you cannot fly if you have any reason to know of any condition that would interfere with safe operation. This is really the whole just kind of like no reckless driving type rule. That's what the FAA really cares about ultimately, is just kind of be responsible. If you're doing something dumb, it doesn't matter if it's specifically written into the law. It's like, yeah, that was dumb. You shouldn't have done that. A couple of other things that are in the law, not that this is really practical for surveyors. Delivery. Delivery is allowed only if the system weighs less than 55 pounds, it remains within visual line of sight of an operator, not from a moving vehicle, and does not cross state lines. Long story short, these are the rules that the FAA has not bent on one bit, and that's why Amazon's not delivering anything by drone. You still need a pilot. You do need a pilot for the foreseeable future. You will need a pilot for every single drone operation, and that pilot needs to see the drone. There are lots of people that want to change that law. I count myself among them as well. I think there are ways to change that law, but that is the law right now. For all practical purposes, delivery is illegal in the US. They've done a couple like test demonstration flights. Any of the deliveries that you might see on the news, those have all been tests under super controlled situations. Until they change this law, delivery is pretty much held back. All right, weather restrictions. This is the real fun. Everyone loves talking about just drone aviation weather. Don't worry, the legal part's not the whole presentation, I promise. There's much more interesting stuff coming up. Legal restrictions. When you fly, you need a minimum visibility of 3 statute miles. Daylight operations only, or civil twilight. Civil twilight 30 minutes before and after sunset. Clouds, you've got to stay 500 feet below clouds or 2,000 feet horizontally away from clouds.
I got a question on that.
Yeah.
Is that if the clouds are in your fly space, or if you have clouds straight above you that are, the bottom base of the cloud is 4,000 feet, can you still fly?
So, wait, the bottom of the clouds are 4,000 feet or 400?
We'll just say 4,000.
Yeah, but you need to be 500 feet below them, so you can have
But
500 feet.
horizontally, you're right underneath of it.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
That is fine.
That's totally fine.
Okay.
You can be under clouds. Yep. No, in fact, that's a huge benefit of this, is even on like totally overcast and very cloudy days, you can fly. The cloud ceiling is almost always going to be more than a couple hundred feet above you. If not, you're just such socked in fog that then you can't fly. But yeah, the clouds can be directly above you, that is fine. They must be more than 500 feet above you. Visibility of three statute miles, as well as the letter of the law there. And lastly, airspace limitations. Well, not lastly, but airspace limitations is another big part of the law. For anyone that's taken the test, they know this is what the test focuses on most. It's reading about airspace limitations. All this pretty much says, this is kind of the detailed chart that I'll give, like I said, I'll give you guys resources that we can go over all this in person or in much more detail after this presentation. But the short answer is, for huge airports, stay away from them or get special authorization. If you're very far from an airport, then you don't need any special authorization whatsoever. Go into a little bit more detail. Okay, you have all of these different classes. If you'd imagine this is the ground right here, this direction is up and down, going up higher into the sky. Enormous airports like Seattle, Tacoma, that's going to be a Class B airspace. Those are the biggest airports in the country, and has all kinds of restrictions. The higher in altitude you get, the bigger the restricted area is. Class C are small and medium-sized airports. Class D, mostly private, very small, maybe executive airports, something like that. And everything else towards the ground is Class G. And we see Class G is only these tiny things at the bottom, but they go up to 700 foot above ground, which is the only area where drones fly. In fact, everything above the top of that Class G area is really for manned aircraft, and you can, for all practical purposes, totally ignore it. Because that's where manned aircraft fly, not drones. You only fly up to 400 feet. That's what the law says. So most of the area is Class G, and if you are near an airport, the systems are getting so much better that the drone itself will automatically notify you that you're near one, and then you can get authorization too. In fact, really nowadays, you can get authorization to fly nearly anywhere. The only question is how much paperwork you want to do for it. We've actually helped a lot of people get different airspace authorizations. Short answer is, like, if you're 5 miles away from the airport, you can probably get something called an instantaneous authorization. You basically just ask for it on your phone and it says, yep, take off. The closer and closer you get to an airport, the higher levels of restriction there are, and you just need to file more paperwork. But we've done everything up to and including surveys of airport runways themselves using a drone to perform a survey on an airport property in restricted airspace, and that is totally fine once you file for the right authorization. What the law says, if you're taking the test tomorrow, what the law says is you can operate in Class G airspace without any permission whatsoever. Everything else is you need permission. Make basic sense? Things near airports. All right. Flying over people. This is the trickiest one of all of them. Letter of the law, you may not fly over other people unless those people are directly participating in the operation of the aircraft, or located under a covered structure or inside of a stationary vehicle. Other employees on a project are not considered to be directly participating in the operation, and people in moving vehicles are not considered to be covered. Obnoxious. Now, I'm going to take my FAA hat off for a quick second and put on my responsible operator. No one cares about this if you're actually operating responsibly. What the FAA really cares about, and what the kind of main thing about this is don't fly over like an outdoor concert with hundreds of people in it. And in fact, if you kind of parse the letter of the law, if you're flying over sparsely populated rural roads, believe it or not, if you look at a photo, even of a fairly densely populated road, the actual amount of footprint that vehicles are taking up, it's like 5% of the road. It's not very much. So odds are, if you fly over a road, you're not actually going to cross directly over a vehicle. And technically, that means you're following the law in perfect, complete legal compliance. So what this often means, we actually see different interpretations from different people. Safest way to follow this when you are doing roads to be in absolute unambiguous compliance is 2 flights, one on either side of the road to make sure that you never have to actually cross over the road. That's a little bit of a pain. Most people design their flights so that they only cross a road once, and everything else, maybe they're flying parallel to it, taking a bunch of photos, so that they don't actually cross over cars or people or anything like that. Also, I should point out, I think the FAA has maybe gotten 2 people in trouble ever for this rule, for flying drones like over public parks in downtown Chicago or something. It's like, that's really what they're getting people in trouble for. But again, for the purposes of the test, that is the letter of the law. Was that a question I spun? No? I'm blind. Pilot certification, pilot in command. This is another requirement of the rule. Like I said, 1 pilot, 1 aircraft, and that pilot needs to be the pilot in command. They're going to be the person that's in command of the operation, but they do not have to be the person operating the controls. Basically, FAA just wants someone that they can say, yes, this is the person who is responsible for the operation. They must have a certificate with a small UAS rating. That's kind of the fancy word for saying your drone pilot's license. And they're responsible for the entire mission, planning, and operation. Now, to get your pilot certification, all you need to do is pass an initial aeronautical knowledge test or hold a Part 61 pilot certificate. That's a manned aircraft. Any manned aircraft pilots in the room? There you go. You don't need to pass the test. You're pretty much already good.
Yeah, I'm good.
But everyone else, you need to pass the Part 107 test, be vetted by the TSA, and be at least 16 years old. Nothing kind of crazy or complicated there. A couple other requirements. Must make available to the FAA on request the drone for testing. You need to report to the FAA within 10 days any operation that results in serious injury, loss of consciousness, or property damage of at least $500 excluding the aircraft. It's worth noting that's actually a ton once you exclude the drone. These things, most of them are so light they actually can't do any damage. If they were to hit a car, yeah, you'd need to get a new paint job, and maybe that, depending on how much paint you heard, that may or may not be more than $500. But you also need to conduct a pre-flight inspection and ensure that the UAV is registered and marked. So yeah, I have been doing this for a couple of years. I've unfortunately talked to a handful of people that have crashed their drone, and I don't know of any time anyone's ever had to report anything because, yeah.
So do you carry any special insurance?
We do. And we recommend that as well. Drone liability insurance for the reasons I just mentioned is actually really, really, really cheap. You can get like $1 million liability policy for a couple $100 a year. It's not particularly expensive, and I don't know, the insurance companies love it because they never have to pay out on it. So yeah, that's one thing there's nothing in the law that requires any sort of special insurance for drones. We think for businesses it's responsible. For public agencies, it's often already looped into other things, part of their policy. We think it's a responsible thing that there's no legal requirement for insurance policies whatsoever. All right, and then lastly what I want to talk about is something called waivers. So all of those rules kind of are a pain, and the FAA has a thing that is written into it called waivers that are more or less exemptions from all of these rules. Here are all of the rules that you can get a waiver from, which, to kind of sum it up, is every single rule on there. Waivers, to put it practically speaking, waivers are kind of worthless. They require an insane amount of paperwork, and often the amount of restrictions that they would put on you to follow the waiver makes it not worth getting the waiver in the first place. It's more practical to do a survey on the ground than it is to get a waiver when you do have to break one of these rules. But there are other ways around it, usually operationally. Like I said, that flight over people is a good example. You're not allowed to fly directly over people. You can get a waiver, which would probably take, a couple of lawyers to get involved or something, and some really burdensome hardware requirements, or just do 2 flights, one on either side of the roadway, and then you're following the rule. So waivers are available, but we don't recommend them. They usually take, at least 6 months to process even, because the FAA is fast with their paperwork. All right, so let's talk about this knowledge test. The knowledge test, that FAA Part 107 exam, it is that one-time test. It covers your knowledge of national airspace, information pertaining to operating in the national airspace. That's all those charts of A, B, C, D, E, F, G airspace. It's applicable to all types of drones. It does include material that is not relevant at all to surveying and mapping, which I'm sorry. But basically anything can be tested. You need a 70% score to pass, and if you fail, you can retry it after 14 days. So this isn't a crazy one. If anyone wants to take it, what we've basically done, we have online training courses. Typically we charge for these, but that's a coupon code that will get you a 5-finger discount and get all of our online training courses for free if you want to take them, so that you can take and go ahead and pass that test. So with that, I was going to at least, questions?
And something out with that information on it?
Yeah, basically I don't actually have handouts, but I have my email at the end. I will give out all the slides if anyone wants to shoot me an email. It's Logan@Aerotas.com. I'll have that up at the end of the presentation. I'd be more than happy to send this information as well. Or I don't know if I can get a list of emails. I'd be happy to send it to everyone after the fact. Okay. So, any other questions about the actual laws, like the federal laws of Part 107 of flying drones, and anything like, is it legal to X? Yeah.
Just the tree coverage thing, is it worth it if, basically, if it's just tons and tons of trees and bushes?
It's a per project kind of call that you have to make. Short answer is a drone can map what it can see. If the tree canopy is totally socked in, then probably not, honestly. If anyone's ever used traditional photogrammetry before, like hired an aerial photogrammetrist, it's literally exactly the same. It's just there's no pilot sitting in it, and they're a little bit closer to the ground, but the same basic principles apply. So can it do parking lots? Absolutely. Can it do, when we talked earlier about that kind of mixed workflow thing, depending on the project site, if it's half trees, half not, people will fly the drone over the whole thing, get a good image, and they'll go and shoot some extra topo points under the trees just to make sure that they've got that area well covered. That's probably the most common thing. Now again, if you're doing just total raw lands and it's all forested in, realistically, you're not going to get much out of that one. But for anything that's been developed or is in development, it's really, really good for.
What about flying over a group of contractors working in schools?
Great question. So flying over a group of contractors working. The letter of the law would say no, but if you actually even talk to anyone that works at the FAA, they would just kind of say, go ahead, didn't say anything. It's extremely common. Lots and lots and lots of people do that. Most agencies are totally okay with that. Insurance companies are okay with that, you're still covered. Like I said, even the FAA is okay with that. But strictly speaking, if you were talking to a lawyer at the FAA, they would say, no, you are not supposed to. Those count as people not involved in the operation. Yeah, it's a little tricky, but it's kind of.
You can fly outside right away, pick up.
Yeah, so the way that works, drone flying with the camera pointing straight down can have up to about 200 feet on either side of the drone where it can still pick up good data. So you can actually get some good coverage without flying directly over stuff.
Let's say at a pre-construction meeting, can you get people to sign waivers to say, I'm okay with it?
Nope. It's done. And that's part of why most people, towards the end of this, the real answer is use good judgment. And I'll go to it a second, and I have some later slides kind of talking more about the practical implications, but there is no FAA police. Like, they don't have cops, and honestly, they're not like a parking cop, right? They're not like going there just trying to get you on this technicality and get you on that one. They care about one thing only, and that's keeping manned air travel safe. And honestly, they're really good at that. The FAA is remarkable at keeping manned air travel safe. That is their main priority, that is their main goal, that is what they care about. If you're not interfering with manned air travel, they kind of don't care. They're like, yeah, if you crash your drone, you're fine. They don't care. That's part of why the rules are like, you could wreck a $100,000 drone, you don't have to do anything. They say that's your problem, not ours. What they care about is safety. And they are very good at that, and it's kind of come to a fault where they say, no, you can't fly over other people, even if they sign a waiver, even if they are involved in the operation. If they're not a pilot, it doesn't count. It's the letter of the law, and again, unofficially, nobody follows that rule. Nobody follows that rule perfectly. But what they do is they fly responsibly, and they fly with small drones. So another thing not on the law at all, most small drone, like the DJI Phantom, with that kind of white multi-rotor that most people have seen, it's on every news story about drones. Actually, it's that picture up there too. They've done tests with that. If that failed in the worst possible way, which means it's upside down, it's powered, and it's flying full thrust, and it hits someone into the head, it still won't kill them. They've done tests with that where they've done dummy models and stuff. I mean, don't get me wrong, you'll have a real bad day, and you're going to go to that. But that's part of why liability insurance is cheap too. You basically, yeah.
Does this cover fixed wing also?
Yes, all of these laws apply to fixed wings and multi-rotors alike. The law makes absolutely no distinction between the two. Fixed wings are going to be more airplane style, single motor. Multi-rotor is going to be these kind of quadcopter or more propeller ones, take off vertically. There are a lot of operational differences. Drone, like the multi-rotors can fly low and slow. The fixed wings typically have to fly higher and faster. But from a legal perspective, they are absolutely identical.
Nighttime, you need a permit.
You need a waiver. They will grant those waivers. But if we're talking nighttime, the biggest issue is not the legal side, because you can get the waiver pretty easily on that one. The issue is the quality of the data that you're going to get. If you fly at night, what the drone sees is mostly black. So you can't actually get good photogrammetry data out of it, typically.
Yeah, that might be more of a recreational.
Yeah, if it's a recreational thing, then you do need a waiver for that. You can get a waiver for that. But honestly, from someone that flies recreationally as well, unless you have a lot of studio grade lighting, it's going to be really dark. It actually doesn't look that great. As someone that's done that a bunch too, you kind of need to have studio grade lighting, which is like the friggin' sun, to be able to make it look good from a drone shot at night.
Are there restrictions on who and where and what you can take pictures of?
No, great question. That is a really good question, and the answer is absolutely not. Now, whether there should be or not, that's a different question. But as far as what you can take pictures of, you can't tell a drone to not fly over and take pictures any more than you can tell someone on United Flight 1872, don't lean out your window and take a picture with your cell phone. From a legal perspective, that's the same thing. It's public space, it's the airspace. You don't own the airspace over your home. That is federal airspace. There's a handful of Supreme Court cases that have really confirmed that unambiguously. You do not own the airspace above your property. The federal government manages airspace, and only the federal government. The state does not own the airspace. The county, the city, private landowners, no one. That's the feds. A lot of people don't like that. There's a lot of people that want to change those laws so that the private landowners, that the states do have more control over the airspace above their own property, at least at different levels. But right now, the answer is that is federal airspace. There are some caveats there. All existing peeping Tom laws, like privacy intrusion laws, harassment laws, those all still apply. If you are using a drone to harass someone, it's still harassment, even whether you're using a drone or a telephoto lens, or you're throwing GoPros into their window with a rubber band attached to it. All of those laws still apply with drones. It's not a drone-specific law. But can you take incidental pictures of other people? The answer is very much yes. There's no law against that.
Let's go back to GoPro.
All right. Oh, yeah.
What's the better way of collecting data, fixed wing or the helicopter style?
That's a great question. We generally recommend helicopter style for about 90% of applications. Not everything. So the helicopter style are much safer in the sense that it doesn't seem like it, because you think they could just drop out of the sky. But they're much safer because they don't have to always be moving. They have an incredible default, safe mode, which is stop. If you think there's something in front of you that you might crash into, stop. The pilot can stop it, the computer software can stop it, and it just sits there and hovers. And if it runs out of battery, there are all these safety things that make it just slowly come down to the ground. Fixed wings have to keep moving all the time, so they're a lot harder, they require a lot more space. They need a runway or launcher or some sort of like throne system to take off, and then when they belly land, which is kind of a controlled crash, it's a little bit more of a pain. So the multi-rotors are much easier to use, they're safer, and they are more versatile. Now, there is one area where that is where the benefits for fixed wings can make up, and that's if you're doing enormous area topos. And I say enormous to me is probably 200 acre plus, and you're doing topos on 200 acre plus properties regularly. Then a fixed wing can make sense because fixed wings can stay in the air for a lot longer. Fixed wing aircraft, just because of science and physics, can stay in the air for about hour and a half, and can cover 300, 400, 500 acres in a single flight. The multi-rotor drone, you'd have to be changing batteries all the time, which you can do, and a lot of people we work with do that. They'll do 500 acre sites with the multi-rotor because it just takes a lot of battery changes. So if you're doing huge sites regularly, fixed wing makes sense, and we'll go into that a little bit more in detail, but generally multi-rotors, we prefer those. All right, next thing that I want to talk on the legal landscape is upcoming laws. Everything that I've already talked about is the law that's on the books right now. That's Part 107, that is live, that's actual law. The last couple of months, at least for those of us in the drone world, you might have even seen some articles, they made it on a lot of different news stories, something called remote ID. This is a new law that the FAA has just passed, which more or less, it's like a digital license plate. Your drone basically broadcasts a series of numbers that is your license plate. It is not your personal identifiable information, just like a license plate, but it will require additional hardware on your drone. So this is literally, it's like a digital license plate on your drone is truly the best way to think about it. Just like your car license plates, it's a random series of numbers, and the police have access to all of the names and registration information associated with that series of numbers, so that when you see it, you can actually, the cops can theoretically track down who's flying the drone. Now, first thing to know about this, it will be 4+ years before this law comes into effect. So this is kind of a slide saying, hey, there's this new law. Don't worry about it at all. The overall impact on drone surveying will be very minor. It's like just a license plate. It'll cost, any drone made in the next 3 or 4 years will have this built into it, so you don't even need to think about it. If you're flying a drone right now, you'll probably need to replace it within the next 4 years, but it doesn't matter about this law because if you're flying a drone right now, it'll probably be obsolete in the next 4 years anyway. Some common misconceptions about this new law, by the way. There are a lot of people panicking all over the internet, and we get lots of angry emails and comments saying, oh, I need an internet connection, but I work in rural areas, there's no cell coverage. That's actually fine, that's covered by the law. You don't need an internet connection in order to fly a drone or do a survey, even under the new law. This is not the same as what is called ADS-B, which is a transponder system that current manned aircraft use. It's a totally different system. It's designed for a totally different use case. But really from a surveyor's perspective, from a surveying and commercial perspective, this is not a huge law. Now, some people are panicking about this, and that is recreational flyers. This law will be a big pain for recreational flyers. Because if you're a land surveyor, if you're doing this for work, an extra $5 fee to make sure that you kind of pass this and submit the right information is not that big of a deal. You already have this good equipment. But if you're someone that just kind of builds drones out of balsa wood and hot glue for fun, this is going to be a really tough law to follow. So that's what all of the kind of uproar and anger on the internet, if you ever do see this, is about the hobby side of things. From a commercial and surveying perspective, totally fine. You can basically ignore this law for 3.5 more years and nothing bad will come of it. So just figured I'd get that out there on the FAA, the remote ID side of things. Now next up, I want to talk about some practical applications of Part 107. Everything before I was very much trying to be mostly FAA's focused, say the law that is the law. Now let's talk about the law and what it actually means when you're using it. First of all, FAA authorization versus no-fly zones. Modern day drones, DJI, for those that are not familiar, is by far the market leader. They make all of the drone, like 90% of the drones that people actually use for this type of thing. they have no-fly zones that pretty much say, hey, if you're over an airport, it won't even let the drone turn on. They got their own GPS on board. The more advanced ones even have RTK GPS on board, which is delightful, because that's really good accuracy for when you're doing surveys. But the FAA authorization zones, like whether it's legal to fly somewhere and whether the drone will take off, those are different things, and it's something that we can always help you guys out with, but it really just is something that's worth noting when you are flying, for those of you that do already fly regularly. Next up is waivers and authorizations. Already talked about waivers and authorizations a little bit. There are really three different types of these waivers and authorizations. One is called LANCE, Airspace Authorizations. Those are those instantaneous ones that I talked about, where at most airports, you can just open up an app on your phone. This one's called AirMap that I showed over, that's on the right. You can open up an app and get immediate authorization to fly there. Manual airspace authorizations take more time, and you can usually get approval. That's if you frequently do work in or around an airport, you can get that. And then waivers, that's a really long process, but those are just kind of some of the differences to be aware of. So now lastly, this is kind of one of those ones that I wanted to talk about a bit more, is flying drones in the real world. The FAA is looking for bad actors, not minor infractions. They do not care, really, if you are flying 5 miles away from an airport and the law says you should be 5.1 miles away. They don't care if you're flying at 402 feet and you're only supposed to do 400 feet above ground. They really are looking, and there are no FAA police. There's really no one to enforce this. There's no way to enforce most of this. What they really care about, and the only things that I've ever seen the FAA go after people, are for reckless flight, that kind of big catch-all. A lot of people are, and I think fairly rightly so, worried that the FAA is like, oh no, I'm doing this for work, am I going to get in any trouble for this? And the answer is almost certainly no. It's like, you got to be real reckless right now to do something. And those reckless people are out there. There are people who are like, oh, I want to get a photo from the end of a runway looking up while a plane takes off above me. That's what will piss the FAA off and get you in a lot of trouble. Not, breaking the edges of, oh shoot, I planned my flight to not go over the road, but I think I hit the stick the wrong way and then I crossed the road. Am I going to get in trouble for that? No, is the answer. No one's going to get you in trouble for that. All right. So, I'm done with the legal part. Yes! All right. We can talk about a little bit more of the fun stuff. Let's see, what time is it? 3 o'clock, we still got a little bit of time. So I'll go through a little bit of the technology, then we can take a break, and then you get to hear even more from me. So, right into technology. We already talked a little bit about kind of different hardware, different drone options out there. The first thing that we talk about when talking about drone technology options are your sensor options, cameras. So this is mostly, 99% of drone surveying that happens right now is done with cameras, and 1%, or actually probably less than 1%, is done with LiDAR right now. With sensor options, most of them come from DJI Phantoms or similar aircraft, where you just have a camera like that that is attached to the drone, attached to a 3-axis gimbal that lets it pivot and look straight down. These things you're looking at for a drone program with absolutely everything included, all of your hardware and training and registration and yada yada yada, 10 grand, usually a lot less than that. You can actually, if you're looking to do it on a budget, you can start at about 3 grand and still have a very solid set of drone surveying capable hardware. Large independent cameras, if you guys really like spending money, you can spend 20 to 30,000 bucks and you can get a little bit better accuracy, typically a little bit more capabilities. But more than anything else, it makes you look cool, and that's why people spend so much money on drones. Realistically, we actually think these ones are a little bit better. They're more reliable and cheaper and more lightweight. In both cases, they get you about 1/10 of a foot accuracy. I'll talk about accuracy a little bit more later. When we say accuracy, we mean that as a statistical measure, root mean squared error. But 1/10 of a foot is, in almost all cases, perfect for paint striping, topo work, stuff like that. Depending on the survey that you need, it's good enough for some curb lines and that sort of thing, but typically not good enough for anything like ADA or wheelchair ramps where it needs to be really, really tight and then you need to break out the total station. I know we were talking about railroads too. These can do most of the surveying on a railroad, unless you actually need like the top of the rail that's then going to the actual railroad company, where their tolerances on those are sometimes like 300s or something. You need a total station, but that's an accuracy, both cases about 1/10 of a foot. Aerial LiDAR. That's something that if you read survey magazines, that's kind of the exciting topic right now, because we were talking about vegetation a little bit earlier. Everyone's like, ooh, LiDAR's gonna be great, it'll punt through vegetation. And we actually really like that technology, except it costs probably about 200 grand in hardware to start with a good LiDAR system. So our general recommendation with that is wait on LiDAR. It's improving rapidly. The costs are starting maybe to come down in the next couple of years. But really the ground cover penetration isn't great, the accuracy isn't great, and the real problem is that it's insanely, stupidly, ridiculously expensive. So if you have the budget, we'd be more than happy to help you guys spend it, but really wouldn't recommend it. It's a technology that's improving rapidly. I would guess it'll be ready in probably 2 to 3 years when it starts becoming more readily available. But then again, I said that 2 to 3 years ago, so I've been wrong on that one before. Questions on sensors, LiDAR?
So the reason it's not good enough is it's too heavy for a drone?
Yeah, so it's very heavy. It requires a huge amount of power consumption as well. LiDAR does, which doesn't matter when you're on like a Cessna, but when you're on a drone, power consumption is pretty critical. And because of that, the drone, when you double like the payload weight, you double absolutely everything else, the drone becomes huge. And then you start pushing that 55-pound limit, and you can still only fly for 15 minutes because you can't put enough batteries on there. So it all kind of like explodes in a really nasty way. That's for unmanned LiDAR. Right now, if you have a traditional aerial photogrammetrist or someone that flies LiDAR on a fixed-wing manned aircraft, that is actually much cheaper than drone LiDAR is right now. Because those systems, I mean, they keep them up in the air 12 hours a day or something. They do a lot of flights. They'll do whole counties at a time. Those systems are pretty good. Drone LiDAR it's getting there, but right now it's very complicated, it's very expensive. And because it's so expensive, not that many people buy it, which then makes it more expensive. It's a little catch-22. All right, next up, talking about airframe options as well. This is kind of related to that, to the other things. So we have small multi-rotors, large multi-rotors, and then your fixed wing or VTOL, which stands for vertical takeoff and landing. Small multi-rotors, DJI Phantom 4 Pro, Mavic 2 Pro, Unique H520, it lists off a million different brand names, it really doesn't matter. The drone themselves usually start at about 2 pounds and actually at about $1,500. You can buy the drone itself. The reason we say 10 grand all in there is because there's all that extra just junk that you need, batteries, registration, often training. Usually you don't want to buy the cheapest model out there, there are fancier versions, but they start at about $1,500 for a totally capable drone. That one has its own built-in camera, super easy to use. That's what is far and away the most common and what we usually recommend. Large multi-rotors are kind of your more hobbyist things. If you have a soldering iron at home and really love troubleshooting software, then that's a great kind of version to go with. They're bigger, they're much more kind of tinkerer friendly, but they are more difficult to use and they cost a lot more money. Typically you're looking at about 20 grand all in, but they can handle a little bit bigger camera. They could handle, theoretically, a LiDAR system, something like that. And then fixed wing one there, they fly higher, they fly faster. As mentioned before, great if you're flying a whole lot of land, not so great if you're doing smaller properties. So that's kind of the trade-off depending on the type of work you do. For most people, because the small multi-rotors are so much more versatile, they'll use those over the fixed wing. And then the latest hardware option to talk about is RTK versus non-RTK enabled. This has been a newer development in the drone world. 3 years ago, RTK capable data, dual band GPS antennas didn't exist on drones, but they do now. So there are a couple of different options for flying with ground control, which is basically you set your targets on the ground, shoot those, tie them with the drone. Versus now, there's RTK and PPK, real-time and post-processing kinematic solutions. That's all of your very advanced GPS stuff. And quite frankly, RTK and PPK now, especially in the past year, the workflow has gotten so much simpler and the data's gotten so good That's our recommended solution. We really like RTK data. Downside is, like all things with high-end GPS, it's way more expensive. The exact same drone that I was saying earlier that would be $1,500 to start with, you slap a RTK antenna on it and you're looking at $8,000 to $10,000 for what is otherwise exactly the same drone, but now it's got RTK stuff on it. That said, if you're a surveyor, you need high precision GPS, so that sort of thing is typically worth it. And that's actually what our recommended setup is just have one of those solutions that is an RTK enabled Phantom 4 or something. Yeah, you're looking at $10,000 to $12,000 all in for a system like that. It's good for probably 3 to 4 years as kind of a lifespan on it, and it gets you really the highest quality data. When we talk about that 1/10 of a foot, we actually usually get better than a 1/10 of a foot accuracy on most projects, but we like to be conservative to make sure that we don't overpromise anything. But that plus all of your batteries, rugged cases, it's important to know that you guys are working in the real world. You're going to throw this thing around, get it beat up in the truck, having the right material to just kind of keep it safe is pretty important. But that'll get you good data. Yeah, question back there.
Is there a way to rebuild or use pieces if you say your drone is working? Can you take the RTK data off that drone and then go to the drone?
Are you saying take the data off the drone or the actual hardware?
Hardware, sorry.
For these types of drones, no. Unfortunately, I don't love it. These are basically an iPhone. You can't take one chunk of an iPhone out and move it. You can't kind of rebuild it. They want you to buy a whole new one after a couple of years. Really, the only things that are interchangeable are the batteries, so you can swap batteries every single flight, refresh those, which is nice, and the propellers, in case one of the propellers breaks, that happens. But other than that, these things are pretty sealed up, black box, unfortunately not very easy to repair.
Can you get insurance to cover that?
Yes, you can.
And would it cost that much more?
Well, not for rebuilding it to like move it to like upgrade. There's no insurance to upgrade. There is insurance if you crash a drone, and yeah, that's not that much more.
I think that's what she was talking about, if you damage.
Or are you saying if it was damaged?
No, I was thinking if it quit working, it was the end of its life, is there a way to repurpose that?
Yeah, end of life, there's really no practical way to repurpose it. What you're talking about, if there were some sort of incident, if you crashed it, if it were repaired, or if it were run over by a truck or something, then there are authorized repair places that can repair it for you at typically a lot less than the original cost.
That's just simply wrong in today's world when we're trying to save the world all the time. We're just throwing drones away in the trash can every 3 years.
I don't disagree. I'm totally on board with you there.
So how many batteries typically
In a typical project? So typical project is a weird term because I bet even within this room, the definition of typical project is pretty different.
It took all day.
Took all day. So let me just make up a project for you here. Let's say you were doing a topo on 100 acres, right? And you needed 1 foot contours. Maybe there was some development in a corner of the property that you needed to get. Had a lot of hardscaping and utility locates that you need to do, that sort of thing. You could do that with 3 to 4 batteries, which would be a total of about a little over an hour flight time. If you count all of the time on the field, that's 2 hours probably of drone flight time to do 100 acres of mostly topo. Probably add another, depending on how you want to shoot your control, add another hour or 2 to go around, shoot a couple control points across the site. Also changes depending on whether or not you have onboard RTK. If you have RTK, you need to set less control in the field, saves a lot more time when you have it. But that's typical. Usually 3 to 4 batteries is enough for, I'd say, 70 to 80% of the projects we see.
Do you carry a generator to recharge the batteries, or?
Nope. In almost all cases, it's cheaper to just buy more batteries. Sometimes there are circumstances where it makes sense to carry a generator, because then you need the generator, you need a lot of extra chargers. It takes about an hour to charge each battery back in full hour, hour and a half. We know there are a few people that do it. Our recommendation typically is just buy more batteries. They're not that crazy expensive.
We've been just running with the inverter in the truck, and
Yeah.
we have 4 or 5 batteries.
Yeah, if you got a good
When you take one
inverter.
off, throw it on the charger.
Yep.
Basically, each battery lasts like 20 to 25 years.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So it kind of depends. If you already have a good inverter, you can run with that. Be careful if you try and charge like 4 or 5 batteries at once and you don't have a super heavy duty inverter, you can blow it, you can blow a fuse or something. But if you start getting into that and it's all like real kind of your specific situation, well, how far are you from the job site? How often do you do jobs like this? How easily, like, are you actually going to be parked with the inverter running, with the generator running? It becomes really, really nuanced. Our usual recommendation is buy more batteries, but if you want to run the inverter or generator, go for it. There's nothing wrong with that if that's the easier solution.
It's generally a small problem too to have when you're doing drone surveys.
I have an EV Plus.
Yep.
And I can do 2 miles of roadway, 1,000 feet wide on one battery.
Yeah, EV is a little different just because it can stay in the air so
On
much
EVs.
longer.
No, we don't.
Oh, yeah, the quadcopters, that's a lighter battery, but with the fixed wing, I can have a bigger battery.
Also, fixed wings, they just stay in the air so much longer that they don't use up as much electricity as the multi-rotors. Multi-rotors use a lot of power.
Do you see the batteries going forward anytime soon where they last a lot longer?
Nope. If you kind of look at the history of battery technology, I'm a total tech geek if that hasn't become abundantly clear by this point. So battery technology in all likelihood will get considerably cheaper, but what we care about in the drone world is not cost per kilowatt hour, it's pounds per kilowatt hour. And the weight density, the energy density of batteries, there's really no technology even on the horizon that is projecting a much lighter weight battery, which is the real problem.
Elon Musk?
Yeah, I know. Well, he's working on making it cheaper. He's doing a great job on that. And that's why they're getting cheaper, but they're not getting lighter because he can stick it on wheels and have it just roll around. All right. Any other question on the hardware for right now? Cool. Let's take a 10-15 minute break, and then we'll actually get into the workflow, what one of these missions actually looks like.